He murdered with his own hands in Riga and built a new life of comfort in South America. But Mossad was watching. What looked like casual conversations, friendly dinners, and business offers was in fact the groundwork for one of the most intricate missions undertaken by Israel's intelligence services in the 1960s. After Eichmann's capture in 1960, the question of whether Nazi fugitives should face trial or be executed became a pressing debate. Newly surfaced archival material and survivor testimony have reframed how Mossad pursued collaborators and how far states may go when courts fail. While these debates played out at the policy level, one notorious figure was already living quietly abroad, his past veiled by a carefully maintained public image. The forgotten war criminal living in luxury. In the years following the war, Herbert Cukurs stood out among Nazi fugitives because he was not hiding at all. While many perpetrators assumed new names or slipped into anonymity, he continued to use his own, openly presenting himself as the renowned Latvian aviator who had once captured headlines with daring solo flights. In Brazil and later Uruguay, he cultivated admiration rather than suspicion. To his neighbors, he was not a fugitive, but a pioneer whose exploits in the air echoed a more glamorous past. He ran small businesses, entertained visitors, and lived as if the war years belonged to another life entirely. For those unaware of what had happened in Riga, his reputation offered an unchallenged protective mask. Before the war, Cukurs had genuinely enjoyed fame. In 1933, he piloted a small aircraft he had built himself on a solo journey to Gambia and back, gaining attention across Europe. Later flights took him further, including a long-distance venture to Tokyo that added to his legend. These achievements made him Latvia's most celebrated aviator, with officials proudly sending him abroad as a national symbol. That prestige persisted even in exile. In immigrant-heavy communities of South America, his accent and background were unremarkable, while his aviation record gave him a local status that many found admirable. In photographs he shared of his younger days beside his aircraft, he looked every bit the heroic figure his neighbors believed he was. Survivors of Riga remembered him very differently. They testified that behind the aviator's polished image was a man implicated in mass violence. He has long been accused by survivors and Nazi hunters of personal participation in atrocities during 1941 and 1942. Executions in forests, expulsions, synagogue burnings, and street raids. Some reports and later journalistic accounts claim that responsibility for up to 30,000 Jewish deaths rested at least partly on him. It is important to note that those numbers come from survivor testimony and post-war investigative summaries, not from a courtroom conviction. Nevertheless, for witnesses who had seen families torn apart and entire communities destroyed, his name carried the weight of terror rather than adventure. This sharp contrast created a paradox impossible to ignore. In South America, he strolled freely through city squares, engaged in commerce, and told stories of his flights, embodying dignity in the eyes of many neighbors. In survivor circles, however, he represented brutality and murder. That dissonance could not be reconciled. To know he was still thriving while the memory of the massacres remained raw was viewed as an intolerable affront. The more his comfortable exile became known, the louder survivors demanded that action be taken. By the early 1960s, those demands reached Israel. The dramatic capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina had already demonstrated Mossad's ability to intervene where justice elsewhere had failed, and it laid a precedent that survivors invoked when speaking about Cukurs. Civic groups organized petitions, survivor associations documented testimonies, and articles surfaced in the press pointing to his freedom abroad. Survivor pressure and the global attention from Eichmann's capture pushed Israeli intelligence to act. Public outrage made inaction politically and morally costly. The longer he remained untouched, the more hollow official commitments to memory and justice appeared to those who had lost relatives in Riga. For Israel, the situation carried both symbolic and practical urgency. The state had been founded in part on the promise of security for Jews worldwide and remembrance of Holocaust victims. Allowing a figure like Cukurs to live openly as a minor celebrity undercut that promise. At the policy level, debates continued about the scope of Mossad's mission and the risks of operating abroad. But at the level of public sentiment, especially among survivor networks, the moral line was unmistakable. A man whose name echoed in witness accounts of shootings and synagogue burnings could not be left untouched. Cukurs had chosen to step into South American life with confidence, relying on his past fame to shield him. Ironically, that same choice made him one of the most visible symbols of impunity. For survivors who tracked his movements and urged authorities to respond, he was evidence of the world's failure to confront the past. For Israeli intelligence, he became a test of resolve in the years after Eichmann. The calm exterior of the aviator concealed a record of accusations that survivors refused to allow the world to forget. These accusations did not exist in the abstract. They were made vivid by witness testimony, by refugee accounts gathered in the years after the war, and by memories preserved in personal writings and interviews. Each story chipped away at the public mask and revealed a very different portrait of the man. It was those voices that carried the immediacy of what had been seen in Riga, that ultimately convinced Mossad that waiting for trial or international cooperation would be insufficient. What those witnesses described would shape how Cukurs' name was remembered and why his presence abroad was so intolerable to those demanding justice. Their accounts take us back to the summer of 1941, when the German occupation of Riga dismantled daily life and perpetrators were given free rein to carry out mass violence. It is within those moments, preserved in testimony, that the true gravity of the accusations against Herbert Cukurs becomes clear. Eyewitness accounts, crimes in Riga. When German forces occupied Riga in the summer of 1941, the city's Jewish community was immediately subjected to systematic persecution and waves of violence. Within those months of terror, survivor testimony consistently linked Herbert Cukurs to public atrocities. Unlike many collaborators remembered only in vague terms, his face, voice, and reputation made him identifiable. Across refugee records, interviews, and archival holdings in places like Yad Vashem, his name recurs in descriptions of shootings, synagogue burnings, the Rumbula massacres, and house-to-house raids. What emerges is not an image of a low-level accessory, but of a man whose presence became familiar at the center of violence. Witnesses repeatedly described early shootings in the streets and on the outskirts of Riga. Groups of men, women, and children were gathered at assembly points before being driven into forests or isolated courtyards. Several survivors recalled seeing Cukurs among armed Latvian auxiliaries, pulling people from columns and executing them at point-blank range. The accounts portray a distinctive role, not one of background supervision, but of direct, repeated participation. His stature and notoriety as a pre-war aviator made him readily recognizable. To those who endured those events, it was his willingness to use his own hands, rather than simply pass orders, that fixed his presence in their memory. One of the most striking and often cited allegations concerned the synagogue fires. Testimonies from residents near the Great Choral Synagogue on Gogol Street described how hundreds of Jews were trapped inside when the building was set alight. Witnesses told of guards who opened fire at windows when trapped victims tried to escape. In multiple independent files, Cukurs was named as present on the scene and armed, seen enforcing the cordon and ensuring no one survived the inferno. These testimonies have survived in different forms and remain among the most detailed allegations attached to his name. The horror of those accounts, the cries from inside drowned by flames and gunshots, gave the synagogue attack its place as one of the defining symbols of Riga's destruction. And in those accounts, Cukurs is named again and again. His identification also features prominently in descriptions of the Rumbula killings in late 1941, during which more than 20,000 Jews were murdered in two mass shooting operations just outside Riga. German officers planned the massacres, but Latvian auxiliaries executed much of the labor. Eyewitnesses later recounted seeing Cukurs moving along the lines of victims, shouting instructions, striking Jews as they were forced forward, and shooting those who resisted or fell. Refugees who later gave testimony to investigators placed him unmistakably at Rumbula, citing his recognizable figure amid the carnage. This consistency across accounts is striking. His name surfaces more often than many other auxiliaries, not because of rumor, but because he had already been a recognizable public figure. Smaller scale but equally chilling recollections also describe Cukurs entering homes during raids or turning up at temporary camps. Survivors remembered him dragging residents into the streets, beating them, or selecting individuals for immediate execution. Some recalled him boasting afterward, presenting himself as an authority without hesitation despite lacking formal command. These day-to-day stories underline a pattern. He acted in public, in broad daylight, with the confidence of someone whose reputation gave him license. The behavior described was not hidden work of the bureaucracy, but acts of violence carried out in plain view. What disturbed many survivors as much as the physical violence was his manner. Testimonies often noted that Cukurs showed arrogance, mocking victims, or flaunting his status as Latvia's famed aviator. The contrast between his celebrated past as a pioneer of solo flights and his conduct during 1941 burned itself into memory. For victims who saw him at close quarters, the sight of a national celebrity turned tormentor left deep scars. They carried those details into post-war interviews, recognition blended with betrayal. By the early 1960s, those testimonies had circulated widely in Jewish communities and Excel networks. They informed refugee files and Jewish historical commissions and became part of the archival record preserved in Israel. Scholars and intelligence officers looking back at Riga did not find vague rumor but consistent references across independent witnesses. Recently, more accessible archival testimony has reinforced how frequently his name was mentioned, highlighting recurring themes: public shootings, synagogue burnings, Rumbula, and home raids. At the same time, the evidentiary boundary was clear. Survivor accounts were consistent and harrowing, but efforts within Latvia decades later repeatedly cited difficulties in meeting prosecutorial standards. Legal authorities struggled to frame the testimonies as courtroom-ready evidence, given the scale of time lost and the challenges of corroborating every detail. This created the very dilemma that would later confront Israeli intelligence. Convincing, detailed accounts of crimes existed, yet the path to a conventional trial appeared blocked. For survivors, this problem only added to the pain. Having witnessed killings firsthand, they preserved names, locations, and memories with searing clarity. Yet legal systems often demanded written records from perpetrators themselves or documentation that the passage of time had all but erased. The result was that men who had arrived in South America with visible blood on their hands continued to prosper, shielded by the legal obstacles erected between memory and prosecution. The case of Herbert Cukurs epitomized this gap. On one side lay hundreds of survivor accounts, voices that remembered his face at mass grave, his voice outside burning synagogues, his gun at courtyards. On the other lay the limitations of national courts hesitant to pursue prosecution without corroboration beyond witness memory. The testimony was powerful, but sat precariously in the sphere between historical record and judicial enforceability. For intelligence services, that contrast was central. They were not weighing the abstract possibility of rumor, they were measuring multiple consistent archives that told variations of the same story. Within those reports, Cukurs was no desk planner. He was remembered as an active executioner, someone whose violence was public and demonstrable. That left stark questions of responsibility hanging in the air. And by the early 1960s, Israeli officials had to decide how to address them. Survivor communities made their expectations vocal. Allowing a man accused in this way to live freely in Brazil was intolerable. But international law had proven cumbersome, and national prosecutions too often founded on evidentiary barriers. That tension between testimony preserved with precision and the near impossibility of turning it into a conventional legal case formed the backdrop against which intelligence leaders weighed their response. The conclusion was unavoidable. if the witnesses were to be believed, and their consistency over decades made them impossible to dismiss, then the question of how justice could be served grew sharper with every passing year. Whether through trial or direct intervention, someone would have to act. The testimonies themselves made silence untenable, and their weight would press directly upon Israeli decision-making as intelligence officers in Tel Aviv examined their options in the mid-1960s. Mossad's dilemma, trial or execution. By 1964, Mossad had reached a pivotal test. The agency was still weighing the lessons of its most famous operation 4 years earlier, the capture of Adolf Eichmann from Argentina. That mission had ended with a dramatic trial in Jerusalem, broadcast worldwide, where survivor testimony transformed public understanding of the Holocaust. On paper, some wondered if Cukurs could be handled in the same way: a capture, a trial, and a definitive legal record. But the circumstances they faced were starkly different, and the debate inside Mossad reflected deep hesitation about whether to repeat the Eichmann model or abandon it altogether. The appeal of another trial was obvious. For advocates, a courtroom meant legitimacy. It provided survivors with a chance to speak and gave the world a documented account of crimes that had often been buried. A trial could bring attention to Latvia's massacres, long overshadowed by higher-profile atrocities, and it could maintain Israel's standing as a state of law, not one willing to act only through secret killings. To them, trials carried prestige. They turned testimony into history. But the risks loomed just as clearly. Eichmann's abduction had itself sparked immediate diplomatic protests and even a session before the United Nations, with Argentina condemning Israel for violating sovereignty. Both countries only later agreed to smooth things over, but the precedent lingered. Cukurs' case promised even greater complications. Unlike Eichmann, who had assumed a false name and lived inconspicuously, Cukurs lived openly under his real identity, cultivating contacts and making himself visible in the community. Approaching him for abduction carried unpredictable risks. He kept a weapon, guarded his movements, and surrounded himself with acquaintances who could quickly notice anything unusual. Extracting such a target would require more agents, more time, and more local infrastructure, multiplying the chance of failure. And if Mossad failed, Jewish communities in South America could be left vulnerable to retaliatory anger. Inside headquarters, the discussion distilled into blunt trade-offs. Trial, maximum legitimacy, but also maximum risk, an operation difficult to conceal, slow to deliver results, and certain to provoke protests abroad. Assassination, speed and finality, but a method that raised diplomatic costs and carried its own moral shadow. Internationally, abducting suspects had already been criticized as a breach of sovereignty and human rights. Another such operation risked fierce condemnation and strained alliances in an already tense Cold War landscape. For the more cautious voices, the legal questions alone undercut the trial option. Where would Cukurs even be brought? Eichmann's capture had required elaborate justifications to the international community. Repeating that process in Brazil or Uruguay, states far less invested in tolerating a breach, might not be possible. A public trial could stall before it even began, blocked by international protest or left mired in contentious legal wrangling. Worse, it might invite spirited defenses that turned the spotlight onto revisionist claims and reopened wounds survivors had long tried to close. For the others, the weight of survivor testimony pressed more urgently. Witness after witness had placed Cukurs at shootings, at synagogues set ablaze, at the Rumbula massacre. His hands, according to those memories, were not distanced from orders typed in an office, but stained directly from carrying out violence. Every month he lived undisturbed in South America added insult. Much of the evidence was based on testimony rather than surviving documents, which made a trial uncertain. What if he were acquitted? What if the absence of paper trails allowed competent defense lawyers to water down the charges? For those most sensitive to survivor accounts, delay and risk of acquittal were intolerable. The strategic calculations ran in parallel with emotional ones. Many Mossad operatives were themselves bound to Holocaust memory as children of survivors or as men who had encountered refugee testimony firsthand. Reports of Cukurs mocking victims at burning synagogues or striking Jews in the streets struck more sharply than bureaucratic culpability. Some within the service believed no legal forum could weigh crimes of that nature with appropriate gravity. Assassination, grim though it was, promised certainty in a way courts could not. Nor was this debate abstract. Intelligence reports in the early 1960s described remnants of pro-Nazi networks in South America, spreading propaganda, attempting to influence immigrant circles, and cloaking themselves in the years' passage. Allowing a man as publicly recognizable as Cukurs to live without consequence risked becoming a rallying point for denial. A public trial might ironically provide him with a stage for revisionist defenders to mount arguments and muddy the waters. For some, silencing him outright closed that door. No speeches, no defense, no theatrics, just an end. Mossad officers also remembered the storm around Eichmann's capture. The months after the Buenos Aires operation had forced the agency and the state into uncomfortable positions, defending themselves on the international stage. For intelligence professionals, the political turbulence had been more taxing than the operation itself. Some did not want to live through another cycle of accusations, sovereignty disputes, and courtroom grandstanding. Covert execution left fewer questions. It would be deniable, direct, and final. The world might murmur, but it would not convene emergency sessions to debate sovereignty once again. As the deliberations stretched, the split resolved into two frames. The first was the hope of legitimacy, a trial that might set historical records straight, amplify survivor voices, and project Israel as committed to law. The second was the pull of pragmatism, assassination to avoid diplomatic upheaval, protect Jewish communities from fallout, and impose certainty where courts might hesitate. In weighing them, Mossad leadership recognized that the world had changed since 1960. Israel no longer had the benefit of surprise. Latin American governments were on alert, and Cukurs, public life meant surveillance would be conspicuous and operations harder to hide. Ultimately, those realities drained momentum from the trial vision. The diplomatic clashes after Eichmann, the public nature of the target, the difficulty of logistics, and the fragile position of Jewish immigrants in South America all pressed heavily. Operation by courtroom might project moral clarity, but it could also bring months of chaos and risk without a guarantee of conviction. Eliminating Cukurs outright offered no spectacle, but it promised closure. By late 1964, the decision had hardened. There would be no repeat of the Eichmann spectacle, no second global trial, no slow relitigation of Riga's atrocities on the world stage. Mossad concluded that Cukurs would never walk into a Jerusalem courtroom. His end would be decided elsewhere. That ruling created a new challenge. If justice was to be carried out in silence, then silence required disguise. Agents could not simply surround Cukurs in the open, nor could they strike recklessly without eroding their own credibility. Any mission would depend entirely on craft, on the careful construction of a cover story capable of drawing him in and holding him close long enough for the operation to succeed. The choice to eliminate Herbert Cukurs demanded more than resolve. It required a plausible partner who could move close without ever appearing suspicious. For this, Mossad assigned an operative a new identity, Anton Kunzler, an alias used throughout the mission. To this day, the agent's true name has not been disclosed. Kunzler, on paper, was an Austrian businessman with interests in aviation and international investments, credible enough to attract attention, but ordinary enough to avoid scrutiny. Years of tradecraft were compressed into this false biography, complete with references to Viennese firms, financial correspondence, and company seals that looked authentic down to the texture of ink on paper. Everything was meant to stand up to casual checks by a man who had grown used to spotting deception. Building this legend was not a theatrical exercise, but a practical one. Mossad had no use for costumes or flamboyant disguises. The task was to withstand long interaction with a cautious target. To make the alias durable, every detail of Anton Kunzler's supposed life was rehearsed. Agents drilled accent and vocabulary until his German registered as natural, not learned. He committed phrases about airports and flight paths to memory, ensuring he could inject technical talk into conversation at will. Aviation, after all, was the hook. Cukurs craved not just money but recognition,